This is a sticker showing you how to put 2 golf bags in the boot of a car. However, this is an Infiniti, not something you would really see at the golf course in this country. For UK viewers, you could be forgiven for not really knowing what this is. It's an Infiniti G37s, which is effectively Nissan's answer to what if I want a 370Z but also like golf and have a bad back. Now, stepping inside, you're met with a surprisingly pleasant cockpit, something that Japanese cars aren't generally known for. Pressing the start button, you're rewarded with the gentle purr of a V6, a 3.7 V6 to be specific. This car has nearly 330 horsepower, or nearly 320 depending on who you listen to. Now, when it was brand new, it would have set you back £37,000, which would go some way to explaining why they didn't sell that many in the UK. Now, if I put us into drive, and on this lovely summer's evening in Cambridgeshire, take us out onto the road, I'll talk a little bit more about just why I'm such a fan of this car. And I apologise in advance because this car park, unbeknownst to me when I first came in, appears to have been ransacked by youths and has holes in it everywhere. Now, the interesting thing about this car is it answered a question that, I don't know, it was never really asked. I joked earlier about it effectively being the answer to people who wanted a 370Z but also wanted to go to the golf course, but many cars already existed in exactly that segment. It kind of didn't really fill a need for anyone. Anyone who played golf wanted to turn up in something German or a Jag, for instance, whereas anyone who wanted a car like this probably wasn't interested in golf. The G37s is quite the technological marvel as well. While £37,000 may sound expensive, what you have to remember is that this had 328 horsepower. And not only that, a 7-speed automatic gearbox as standard, 4-wheel steering as standard, which Nissan will tell you isn't super high-CAS, but basically is, as I'll go into a little bit more later, and as well as having sat-nav, adaptive steering, climate control, cruise control, many things that at the time, especially considering we're talking the late 2000s, you'll have paid extra for if you wanted a BMW 3 Series or a Merc E-Class Coupe. Now, driving around, I'm currently in the manual mode, which is, if I'm going to be honest, not the most responsive manual mode you'll find. Again, this is a late 2000s car, but I'm not going to sit here and pretend that the Germans weren't doing a much better job of implementing automatic gearboxes by the time this came out. Certainly having driven examples of the early 8-speed in BMWs, they are a lot stronger. This is a little bit hesitant to respond sometimes to gear shifts, and also its kickdown is interesting to say the least. You do have a kickdown switch at the bottom of the throttle, but when you're in manual mode, I personally would expect to not have that kickdown switch. I'd expect to be able to push all the way to the floor and just control the gears myself. However, while it won't force an upshift, if you hit the kickdown switch even in manual mode, it will force a downshift, as I'll try and demonstrate later. Now, driving it around small villages like this, you'd be forgiven for forgetting that it's actually as large of a car as it is, because it does drive very well in tight spaces, and it doesn't feel like you're driving a large wallowy car. It's hard to remember that this thing weighs over 1.7 tons in UK trim. It turns brilliantly, which is in many ways a very big credit to the 4-wheel steering system. And classic British scene here. We love a tractor. We also love losing our train of thought, but I've committed to the one-take aspect of these videos, so we shall keep on. The nice little speed thing telling me that I'm not speeding, which is always good. But yeah, you'd be forgiven for not realising it's as big, which, as I was saying, was a massive testament to the quality of the 4-wheel steering system, because it really does help out in places like this, where you're not having to apply much lock to get around tight spaces. Now, continuing on, I'm going to pop it back in drive now. We'll just appreciate what it is like to drive just gently around. The gearbox in drive is still a little bit chonky compared to the more modern gearboxes that were being implemented by the Germans at the time as well. Nissan's 7-speed was based quite heavily on the Jatco 5-speed, which is who makes the gearboxes for them, and it does show. Having driven the 5-speed, it really does just feel like the same gearbox, but with a gear at the start and a gear at the end added on. Kind of not brilliant when kicking down, not the fastest shifter, but that's not to say it's a bad gearbox at all. It's very, very good at being smooth, and it's also very good at utilising the low-end power band of this V6 engine. It's quite happy to kind of drizzle around at 1500 RPM without much of a care in the world. Once we get out of this village and onto some slightly better roads, I'll open it up and give you an idea of what it's like when pressing on a little bit. In terms of other aspects of the car, the suspension is brilliantly compliant. It still gives you a reasonable amount of road feedback, which is always pleasant, while still being quite comfortable, which was a surprise when I first drove it. I was expecting it to either be one way or the other and not be able to mix the two things very well. I'll punch it out of here as we hit the national speed limit. Give you an idea of, see what I mean about the auto kick down there despite not pulling the paddle. It presses on quite nicely. It's very, very easy to end up going a little bit too fast, as I may have found out a few weeks ago, but we shan't talk too much about that. Once you're up to speed on a country road, you really do get an idea of just how much the four-wheel steering does. Turning into corners, it tightens up nicely, which is one of the big problems I have with a lot of larger sports coupes, is how light the steering is. In this, you don't ever really get a sense of that. It tightens up beautifully once pressing on slightly on country roads. It doesn't stay as light as it does at low speed, which is very handy. One of the main things that I was really, really impressed with as well when I first started driving this was the fact that the rear end keeps in check surprisingly well and the front doesn't understeer. Again, a testament to that four-wheel steering system, because despite the 300 horsepower plus output and the 1700 kilo plus weight, it does only run on 225 section front tyres and 245 section rears, which for a car of this size and power, you'd often consider to be a little on the low side. Now, I'll bore you just a second explaining how the four-wheel steering works in this car, because it's certainly something that I find really quite interesting. At low speeds, the electronic rear steering setup turns the wheels in the opposite direction to the front wheels. And what that means is you get a much better turning circle, and it also is a lot easier to steer. Now, parking and everything is made a lot easier. I didn't realise that the system worked at such low speeds, because I've driven many cars with four-wheel steering where it does nothing below about 20 miles per hour. I'll slow down for this horse here, hopefully not scare them too much. However, as you build up the speed, instead of the rear wheels turning in the opposite direction, the rear wheels turn in the same direction, something that seemed a bit counterintuitive to me, but what it does is it aids in rear end stability. It makes it less likely for the rear end to step out, especially in very high speed corners, something you can't really experience driving, especially these roads, which, as you might be able to tell by the odd rattle coming from the otherwise very well built car, are awful. But certainly on the racetrack, having had a small amount of experience driving this in such an environment, is something you do really begin to notice. It's very, very surprising just how compliant this car is, pigeon, on the track or on a high-speed road. Now, as I slow down into the 40 zone, I'm not going to pretend that everything about this car is absolutely brilliant. There are some major flaws with it. One of those things is the fact that there is a reason that towards 2010 and 2011, turbochargers started to become really, really common. Because when driving a car slowly and off boost, when it has a turbocharged engine, especially modern turbocharged engines, you can achieve fantastic fuel economy out of them. In this, you can't. Give up. The 3.7 V6, even at motorway speed on cruise control at 2000 RPM, does not sip fuel. Getting above 30 to the gallon is a nigh on impossibility, something that the equivalent model 335i, for instance, would be able to achieve very easily. And realistically, that's the kind of car this was going up against. It didn't really sit in a high enough vehicle profile to go up against things like the 6 Series, which would be a lot less economical due to the choice of engines available at the time in them. However, while the fuel economy is terrible, it can run quite happily on 95. Obviously, a lot of cars in the UK can run quite happily on 95, but you'll find that a lot of higher performance cars really do prefer 98, 99. In this, difference is not noticeable whatsoever. It really is quite happy on the cheapest supermarket crap you can throw at it, which is probably something to do with the fact that it was brought up in America, where the fuel, at least in terms of the entry-level fuel available at supermarkets, is more equivalent to Mogadon than petrol. Now, coming round here, the other big flaw of this car is the fact that while a lot of reviewers did say, when it was new, that it was a very well put together car and in some ways better put together than the equivalent German car, the interior and the build quality doesn't quite age as well. Now, this has done 77,000 miles, and there are already quite a few rattles coming from the car. There's a rattle down there, there's sometimes a rattle from up here, and there's a rattle from the rear, which I definitely should have gone there because I feel like I'm going to be waiting for a long time now, which can be somewhat of an annoyance. With the exception of the rattles though, the terrible fuel economy, and if you renew by the depreciation, this does still, I think, make a fantastic used car buy for a UK buyer. This car, with 76,000 miles on when I bought it, as well as a full service history and in overall pretty good condition, cost me at auction just £5,000. 5 grand. At the moment in the UK, a manual 350Z from 5 years prior to this, in good condition, will set you back around 6. Now, I'm not claiming that that auction price is what you would pay at retail for this car. Realistically, in this condition and with this mileage, you'd be looking at around the 7,000 mark. But it does beg the question, for £7,000, what else can you buy at the moment? Now, you can start to see 335i's popping up for that kind of money, but they'll be very leggy, and also the engines definitely aren't faring as well as the VQ37 in the front of this. You might just about be able to find a newer gen Jaguar XK, but again, it'll be a non-R, it'll have over 150,000 miles on it, and it'll be less powerful and less economical thanks to the unsupercharged V8. In terms of finding a car that puts the aspects of being able to drive very slowly around town very comfortably, being able to motorway cruise very comfortably, while still being able to, while I would say attack a country road with vigour, I would say enjoy a country road with some vigour when pressing on. I don't think there's anything for this kind of money that really combines all of those things as well as this does. But the issue is, they're so hard to find. This car is one of probably only about 4 currently available for sale in the UK. 4 in the whole country. And that's a guess based on having looked over the last few months at various points. These really did not sell well. And I think the problem is that these came out at the wrong time for the wrong purpose, as I mentioned earlier. Nobody in their right mind at the time this came out was going to spend £40,000 on a glorified Nissan, while Lexuses have fantastic reputations for being very well built and having that Toyota reliability while still being a very luxury item. Infiniti hadn't been around in the UK for that long and certainly hadn't sold any cars in large numbers. So this car was not fantastically received by the general public. While reviewers loved it, the public just didn't. They never really got excited by it, which, as much as I would try and say isn't understandable, is pretty fair, because for the same amount of money you could go out and buy a very nice German car, which again at the time in this country was all anybody had started to care about. Not only that, but since 2010 the new car market has been dominated by monthly payments rather than cash prices, and with the depreciation on these, those were terrible as well. But I really would say that it's a massive shame that these didn't sell as well as they did, that these didn't sell as well as they could have, sorry, and lead to a better used car market for them in the UK, because as an overall package, I think a lot struggles to beat it for the price.